Welcome to The Rest is Politics Leading with me, Rory Stewart.
And with me, Alastair Campbell. And Rory likes our guests to have a backstory. And he particularly likes backstories where the guest has emerged from some terrible poverty in their childhood and gone on to great things. And our guest today, Alan Johnson, certainly fits that bill. In fact, his childhood is the subject of one of several best-selling memoirs that he's written, all of which have Beatles songs as their title. And in addition to that, he's most recently written a biography of Harold Wilson, former Labour Prime Minister. He's written novels. And before all that, of course, it was one of our best ministers, I would say.
Thank you.
5 different cabinet positions. Well, definitely one of our most reliable, put it that way.
I've been downgraded. I started off as best and now I'm
best
reliable.
To most reliable. And also somebody I think that a lot of people in the Labour Party kind of saw as prime ministerial material, but I don't know if Alan ever did. And we'll maybe talk about that a bit as well. So he's certainly had a very interesting life and a very interesting take on recent political years.
Well, Alan, thank you for joining us. Give us a sense, please, first, of the world you grew up in and what the difference is between the world you grew up in and the world today, what we wouldn't recognise about your childhood today.
So the world I grew up in was photographed by a famous photographer called Roger Main, who's just had an exhibition at the Courtauld of a place called Southam Street in North Kensington, London West 10, not Notting Hill. We never called that Notting Hill. Notting Hill was the posh end, up where the Albert Hall was and places like that. Yeah, near where Rory lives. This was a poor area, always a poor area, tragically most recently defined by Grenfell Tower, because the slums we moved out of, they then built high-rise flats, one of which was Grenfell. So it was that bleak post-war world. There were slums everywhere. I mean, the government should have pulled these houses down. They were condemned as unfit for human habitation in the 1930s, and we were still living in them. And Roger Main captures the squalor of the outside. I described the squalor on the inside.
What was the squalor on the inside? What was in the house? What wasn't in the house that people would take?
Well, there was no electricity
today?
For a start. So I lived my first 6 years by gaslight, and a little guy used to come on a bicycle to light the gas lights out in the street, and our mother used to tell us it was the Sandman come to send us to sleep. So one room, then progressing to 2 rooms and finally 3 rooms, as lots of people lived in. Multi-occupied basement and then 3 stories. No electricity, as I said, no hot water, no heating, no toilet, no bathroom, a butler sink on the landing in one place. But if you wanted to go to the toilet, we were on the top floor when we moved down to 149 Southam Street. You had to come down 3 stories, go down to the basement, out to the backyard, right at the back of which was this awful Kazi that you didn't want to visit when the sun was shining, never mind in the middle of the night. And so you use buckets. I suppose in posh houses it would have been called something else, but we had buckets. And because you had to go down on that journey to empty the buckets, you didn't do it that often. There were flies, there were vermin. These houses were jerry-built, terribly overcrowded. Roger Main, just look at a Roger Main photograph and you'll see what it was like.
You said once there was a time when the difference in life expectancy between North and South Kensington was the same as that between North and South Korea.
No, that's now. 16 years now. We know from Grenfell.
Now?
Yeah. We know from Grenfell the statistics now. I mean, we get them all over the place, and it's true. They say you go on the underground, get on the Jubilee line at Westminster, go 7 stops to Canning Town, your life expectancy goes down a year with every stop. Nothing to do with London Underground. It's the same if you go on the bus. But that is the famous statistic. Because of Grenfell, people looked into the difference between North and South Kensington. And it's still, North Kensington is a very poor area. South Kensington is a very plush area, Royal Borough of Kensington. But you couldn't get a bigger contrast. And it just happens to be the same contrast as between North and South Korea.
And you mentioned your mum. Your dad sort of disappeared early, yeah?
Yes, my poor mother. Well, my book is really the story of 2 amazing women who happened to be my mother and my sister. My father was feckless, is probably a good word, but he also, worse than feckless, he came home drunk and used to beat my mother up. So I say in the book, and it's very true, my sister is 2.5 years older than me, and he took a great responsibility for bringing me up.
When your mum died?
Yeah, we started as a 2-parent family. Then we were a 1-parent family when my father did a moonlight flit when I was 8. And then we were a no-parent family. So my sister had a very important role in that. But the happiest...
Your mother died when you were 12.
She died when I was 12, when I was 13, just turned 13. But the happiest day of our lives, me and my sister say, is when our father left. And people say, well, that's a strange thing. Well, no, it's not. It's great if there's a happy family there. If your father is beating up your mother and you hear it in those places, because the walls weren't very thick, there was, at least one family on each floor, sometimes 2, 4 stories. You heard it all in graphic detail. And he was an awful, very cruel man. And we were very pleased when he ran off with the barmaid from a pub called the Lads of the Village, and we never saw him again.
And when you became like a public figure, never got in touch?
No,
or never?
No, never.
And what would you, do you feel good about that? Are you just glad he's never
I'm
been
fine
part
about
of
that. He means nothing to me. But my sister got in touch for reasons I won't. But my sister was the heroine here. So she had fought battles with my father, stayed up to protect my mother when she got to about age of 10, cooked my Christmas dinner when she was 8 and I was 5. And he had gone off with his girlfriend over Christmas. My mum was in and out of hospital all the time. She had a condition called mitral stenosis, which first of all had to be diagnosed and then you had to have it's the valve between the 2 chambers of the heart, and it had to be cleared every so often. And in the end, she went, people still get it now. What's happened now is you can replace the mitral valve with a plastic version. She was one of the very early people who that was trialled on. They'd done it in America, and she was convinced by a heart surgeon at Hammersmith Hospital, which was a local hospital to us, but a great cardiac hospital, to have the operation. Not many people have had it, but you'll extend your life for 20 years. She died in the operation. So she shouldn't have been in those conditions. She had the misfortune to have married a feckless husband. So the tragedy, the hard life, people say to me, you had a hard life. I didn't have a hard life. The hard life was my mother, and in many ways her generation.
You say you didn't have a hard life, but I guess most of us grumble about our lives, but we didn't have our father walk out on us, our mother die at the age of 12, grow up in that kind of poverty. I mean, how do you think that through in terms of your own life, your mental health, trauma, the kind of influences it's had on you?
Well, I think I'm fine. I wouldn't like to be psychoanalyzed, but basically everyone around you just look at the Roger Main photographs. Everyone around us lived like that. And there were harder stories than that. I've read harder stories of people who had it much harder. And they had it hard in Leeds and Liverpool and Glasgow and my mum was a Liverpudlian, from a family of 11. Her life, if you want to talk about a hard life, her life was hard. But, we were the benefits, me and my sister, of that post-war
Tell us a little bit about her life then, just for a second, about her childhood and how your mother grew up.
So she was one of 11, born to a Irish mother and a Scottish father in Liverpool. So her mother had 11 children by the age of 38, died at the age of 42. Her mother had died aged 42, my mother's maternal grandmother. My mother was always convinced there was some curse of the female line that meant she would die at 42, and she did, precisely at 42. But because she was the eldest girl, second eldest of the 11, but the eldest girl, she had to take on the kind of all the responsibilities. So that was very tough. My maternal grandfather was, he wasn't entirely a liberal person, like most of the men weren't with those big families. So she had to struggle, left at the first opportunity, aged 18. War had been declared, 1939, went to London, joined the NAFI, met my father, who was a pianist, concert pianist, and he was a lance corporal. Played the piano in white gloves, was a very good musician, very good pianist. And they got married, and he took her back to where he came from. The other thing that the area I come from is famous for is Rillington Place. Number 10 Rillington Place was just round the corner to us, where Christie killed all of those women.
So were they under the floorboards?
Under the floorboards in the wall. Just to conclude this real-life crime episode, Kelso Cochrane was murdered on the corner of my street. Kelso Cochrane, the Stephen Lawrence of his time, 1959, Bank Holiday Monday, on the corner of the street. I tell the story in this boy. My mother had come round and seen these teddy boys. He was a West Indian carpenter coming back from Paddington Hospital, and they knifed him to death on the corner of our street. Suddenly there were cameras. Southam Street was famous. And it's still not resolved. No one was ever arrested for the murder of Kelso Cochrane. But there is a little blue plaque outside the Warwick Arms, and I hope it's still there, on the corner of Goulburn Road and Southam Street, that records the life of Kelso.
And you mentioned your sister as being kind of heroine of your life, really. So how did that transpire, that she essentially became your guardian?
Well, for a start, as we grew up, as I've mentioned, my mum was in and out of hospital, so Linda was looking after me, particularly after my father went when I was 8, but also before then because he was never there. So she was working hard to clear my mother's debts. The electricity was always cut off. My mum had 6, 7 different jobs cleaning at the posh houses, top end of Ladbroke Grove. And we used to go with her, by the way. And we used to feel sorry for the kids we heard about there because they were sent away to school when they were 7 or 8. And to us, well, you, Rory, to us, that was deprivation. We felt sorry for them.
Oh, you see.
So she had all of these. All of these jobs. I forget what your question was. What were you asking me?
I was really just about to tell us the story of your sister.
Oh, and my sister. So when my mother died, I said to my sister, well, what do we do? Because she said to me, don't tell anyone. Don't tell anyone at school. Don't tell anyone. The authorities will come and take you away. Now, we were under the radar system of whatever social services were around. I got free school meals. Linda got free school meals. That was good. That was really, really helpful. But they didn't seem to notice. You know, we were 2 kids. She was 16, I was 13. And she said, don't tell anyone or they'll come and separate us. And then through the door came an offer of my mother lived her whole life waiting for a council house. That was everyone in our street. That's all you were waiting for, was a council house. The idea you could afford to buy your own house. My mother on her own, you know, with a cleaner's char lady's wage. So through the door, after she died, came to Lillian May Johnson, my mother, offer of a council house in Welwyn Garden City. I'm often glad I didn't take it because Grant Shapps would have been my MP. But anyway, leaving that aside, my sister marched straight. She was very forceful, Linda. She got the electricity put back on. She matured very quickly because she had to. She worked from the age of 11 to clear my mum's debts at Berriman's on the corner shop, because we would always get stuff on tick, and Mr. Berriman never refused us. But in the end, the bill got quite large and Linda started working for him. Anyway, she marched around to the council, said, my mum's dead, but me and my brother will have this. And she had to, she lived in Australia for 40 years, but she still has this naive view that she was right, that council house offer should have been in the family. You should have been, you died, but it passed on to your children. Anyway, the guy at the council said, don't be silly. The age of majority then was 21, wasn't even 18. So into our life came this wonderful social worker, and he came round and said, right, Alan, you're going to foster parents in Chelsea. Linda, who'd left school to train to be a nursery nurse, you'll go to Dr. Bernardo's big headquarters in Ilford, and you'll continue your studies to be a nursery nurse while you live in there. And he stepped back. I think Mr. Pepper, his name was. It wasn't Sergeant Pepper so much as I knew, but he said, Mr. Pepper, stood back waiting for a round of applause. My sister tore into him. I could see her now, hand on hip, nose wagging under this big Linda-shaped flea in poor old Mr. Pepper's ear. He went away and got us a place. 2 kids, council flat. Linda went to look at it. She said it's I never saw it, worst place. Council must have thought 2 bits of kids would give them the worst place that you could, She said the previous tenants had taken the doors off to burn as firewood, the interior doors. It was awful. She rang Mr. Pepper up, put her 4p in, pressed button A, and said, about this, we're not accepting it. And Mr. Pepper was flabbergasted. Look, do you know what I've been through? She said, well, you go and look at it. If you think you can live there with your family, come and look me in the eye and tell me, and I'll think about it again. We never heard of that again. We got this lovely masonette 2-bedroom, first time we'd ever had an indoor toilet, at number 11 Pitt House on the Wilberforce estate in Battersea, which meant we had to go south of the Thames. That was traumatic,
of course,
but we got over that. And we had two happy, till my sister got married when she was 19, we had 2 happy years there. She moved to a house in Watford with her first husband. He put down a mortgage on a semi-detached, and she wanted me to go to Watford. I said, I'm not moving to the north. I put my feet down. I put my foot down.
You got into grammar school, is that right?
I was in Sloane Grammar School, yeah.
So you sat the 11 plus? And...
Passed the 11 plus. Yeah. Linda passed her 11 plus. Mainly, I mean, we knew our mother saw that as the route out of those conditions. She was very important to her that we passed. And once we'd passed, although Holland Park Comp was just starting off, well, that was the posh family sent their kids there. To my mother, that wasn't a grammar school. And actually, my mother was still alive, of course, when we went around and got interviewed by St Clement Danes, where Frank Field went to school, Sir Walter St John's in Battersea, and they refused. And my mother thought that we were interviewing them to see if the school was good enough for her son. We soon realised they were interviewing us to see if the son was good enough for their school. And it must have been a bad year at Sloane Grammar School in Hortensia Road, King Street, just off the King Street in Chelsea, because I got in there. So that was great, the early 60s on King Street in Chelsea.
So apart from
the King's Road, I should say.
Apart from living the King's Road and the 60s, what was school like? I mean, did you do well at school?
It was awful. It was awful. There is one. So my first novel I dedicated to my English teacher, Peter Carlin, and he was great. And so was the guy who taught us history and economics, Peter Pallai, who'd escaped the Hungarian Revolution and was teaching in our school. And they were 2 young teachers. And I liked the subjects, but Mr. Carlin wasn't my English teacher till I was 14. I left at 15. So it's my last year. They inspired me. Nobody else does. Nobody else did. And I've talked to Mr. Pallai and Mr. both of whom are still alive at a great age.
And you still call them Mr. That's nice.
I do, actually. It's very difficult not to. But they both told me about the French teacher, Mr. Harris. I would say, Dolly Harris, he was so boring. People dozed off in his lesson. He dozed off in his own lessons once, I remember. And Peter Carlin told me, you do know he only had sort of conversational French. He wasn't a French teacher. He was a chemistry teacher. People think this, that the grammar school era was wonderful. It wasn't wonderful, the grammar school era, if you didn't pass your 11 plus. The motivation for me, not just, my mother would approve and we wanted to please our mother. It was if I'd failed, I'd have gone to the god-awful Isaac Newton Secondary Modern School for Boys at the bottom end of the Portobello Road. That was a blackboard jungle. And you kind of knew that and you sensed that you'd be very uncomfortable there. But that's where 80% of kids went.
So your sister married young. You married young as well, didn't you? You had 3 kids by no time.
Yeah, my sister got married at 19, I think it was. I got married at 18, so I beat that, yeah.
And then worked in a sorting office.
Well, first I tried to be a rock and roll star, but I know you don't want to spend much time on that. I made a record when I was 16, all that. But then, so worked in Tesco's, stacking shelves. And then when I was 18, I joined the post office as a postman in Barnes, London, South West.
And did you have political views then?
Yeah. Same Mr. Carlin, who, was this mentor to me, this great teacher. He introduced us to George Orwell. He got us all reading Animal Farm, passing the book between our hinge-lidded desks to read a page each and then passing it on. And he explained the subtext. This is 1964, the year after the Cuban Missile Crisis. We were going out into a world, a third of which population lived under communist rule. And he explained the subtext of Animal Farm and, the Bolshevik Revolution and who the different characters were. It's fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And then I was always a reader. My mum dragged us to the Ladbroke Grove Library as soon as we were old enough to turn a page. And I read so much Orwell very quickly. And he was a democratic socialist, and I decided very soon I was a democratic socialist. But always tempted down that route. The Communist Party, communist was a big, I unlike Harold Wilson, who we'll talk about in a minute, I did read the first volume of Das Kapital and kind of used to show off about surplus value, my deep knowledge of surplus value. But there was always Orwell. warning against totalitarianism. That
So
root.
you flirted with communism? Or with the
I never
party?
even flirted. There's some things there that says I was a member of the Communist Party. I wasn't. I used to read,
Right.
Newsline sometimes, which is the Workers' Revolutionary Party.
Can you take us back to this? Because it's something that Alastair doesn't want to talk about because he hates dissension within the left. So whenever I try to get him to talk about Trotskyites and the Communist Party and all sorts of things, he says, no, I don't want to talk about that. It's all too painful. I don't want to go there. Given it's now ancient history and it's not going to get everybody up, and maybe it's a route into your book on Harold Wilson. Give us a bit of a sense of left-wing politics in the 60s and 70s and what the spectrum was. And so that, because I'm trying to understand, I mean, who is Tony Benn? Who's Jeremy Corbyn? What are Trotskyites? What are Stalinists? How did the Labour Party relate to communism? What was this whole story?
Well before that, before I could judge the Parliamentary Labour Party or what was happening in politics, I was into the trade union movement. So once I was a postman, very quickly I became a local representative and then became the branch chairman and then went to conferences and all of that.
This is the UCW, Communications Workers.
Yeah, they were called Union of Post Office Workers then, and had a great general secretary called Tom Jackson, and all these with the big handlebar moustache.
Yeah.
And we were in a 7-week strike when I was 20 in 1971. Which was very formative.
That's when workers withdraw their labour.
Yeah. It's nothing to do with coffee striking. But the Communist Party of Great Britain were very influential in the trade union movement. And these were great characters, I have to say. In my union, a guy called Maurice Stiles, kind of hammer and sickle tattooed onto his chest. They believed in something fundamental and they lived by their beliefs. Dear old Maurice would give his money away and lived in place in Brixton that kind of, could have been furnished better than it was. And he was a full-time union official by then. And, this idea of a worker state appeals to a worker who's seen what the capitalist state can do, if you like. There's some of the, the issues about my mother's life. But there was always Orwell holding me back. I was never attracted to the idea of dictatorship of the proletariat, which is dictatorship. This idea, the more you read about it, the reason this is the Communist Party line, the reason you disagree and why so many working people disagree is false consciousness. That never really, and I put that down to Orwell. I put that down to him. He died before I was born, but, you can learn a lot as an autodidactic that stands you in good stead. And of course, Tom Jackson and people like him, the main story of the trade union movement were people who stood against that and stood for the Labour Party. Joe Gormley, good example in the NUM.
But before we get in the names, though, this is very important, isn't it, in the whole history of the British left, which is their trade union movement often had a more sort of, I guess, a kind of what we might now call a more patriotic, less communist element to the British left, and that somewhere in this whole story, leading into Wilson and your book, is the story of why Britain and the British Labour Party, unlike European left-wing movements, never went quite so left-wing. And the trade union movement is part of that story, right?
Yes. At a time when trade union leaders were powerful figures and had control over their local shop stewards, is when that control broke down. And that largely happened over the Second World War. And they found themselves unable to intervene, that things like In Place of Strife and Wilson and Barbara Castle, all that came up, and the need to stop this incredible level of almost anarchic strike action. Local shop steward would decide withdraw the labour. People at union headquarters never mind regional level, never got anywhere near it, and found that suddenly all the people were out on strike and they had no levers to pull to get them back in. It's a sad story, but basically in the Labour Party, at a time of block votes and all that, all bad stuff, they were keeping the Labour Party on the straight and narrow, if you like. So the vast majority of the PLP, Parliamentary Labour Party, were solid supporters of the Labour Party. And the Labour Party, famously said by Morgan Phillips, one of its general secretaries, owes more to Methodism than Marxism. And actually, that does bring us straight to Wilson, because Wilson's politics were forged in nonconformist, congregational religion, Methodism, really.
And tell us a little bit, why Wilson? Why did you choose to write about Harold Wilson? And maybe remind younger listeners a bit about why they should be interested in Harold Wilson?
Like you two, yeah. Well,
thanks, Alan. I'm not.
what year were you born?
I'm 67.
Yeah, so that means
1957.
57. Okay.
So I can.
All right,
remember.
you were 7 when Wilson was elected.
Yeah, but I was very, very precocious.
I'm being nice to you, Alastair. Yeah. Well, like you, Rory, who weren't around at the time. Why Wilson? Because Swift Press, who should be commended, by the way, they realised that there was a lot of interest in prime ministers, mainly because there'd been 6 in a fortnight, whatever it was. But if you wanted to know about Gladstone or Churchill, you had to pick up a volume that's like, 1,500 pages and doorstep. Yeah. And Penguin have been running this series of great monarchs, condensed 30,000 words, and they thought it's time to do it with prime ministers. First one was out in July about Winston Churchill. This is the second. And I was given the choice. Do you want to do Callaghan or do you want to do Wilson? Uh-huh. And I wanted to do Wilson. He was so much a part of me growing up.
And a very, very interesting character.
Oh, interesting. I mean, we'll get on to the book, but...
Tell us about him.
Well, because it's 30,000 words, you actually hone everything down. Yeah. And you get rid of the kind of, the boring stuff about minutes of whatever meetings or what usually happens with these books about battles that nobody's interested in now that you fought years ago. And you focus on the main stuff. This could be, I'm not saying because I wrote it, but it'd make a great film. Wilson was there in everything from the 40s, the 50s, the 60s into the 70s. He's like Alfred Hitchcock with his films. There was always a cameo of Hitchcock in the background. If you look at all these things, the devaluation in 49, coal nationalisation.
When you're the Prime Minister, that kind of happens.
No, he's not. Yeah, but this is when he's still way before he's Prime Minister. Way before he's Prime Minister. That's my point. You look at, Bevan's great resignation over teeth and glasses. There's Wilson. Big walk-on part in that, but a little walk-on part in other things. Keeler happened before he was Prime Minister.
So who was he? Give us a sense of his
So
life.
he was, I like him a lot, by the way. Never met him, but I like him a lot.
Quite a few times.
Did you?
Yeah.
Everyone who's met him, and I had books dedicated to a woman called Sue Utting who worked for him for over 10 years. And Sue then worked for me years later in Parliament. But Sue... and everyone who knew him, George Howarth in his constituency, Conservatives who I've spoken to about Wilson, who remembered Wilson from the smoking room, his famous pipe and all that, they all say the same thing. As a person, he was completely without pretentiousness, completely, which once you've been Prime Minister, you might not have had much pretentiousness when you were, before you became Prime Minister. After you leave, there's a certain pomposity. None of that with Wilson at all. He was kind, he was generous, he was thoughtful, very humane.
But as a politician...
Is the man. As a politician, he was a master of the arts. I mean, a master of all the political arts. Elected 4 times, matched only by Gladstone. Won a European election, which Cameron lost. People said he was wily, he was slippery. They were mainly people who had been outsmarted by him. Or there were people who were jealous of his talents because his talents were numerous. A lot of this book is about before he becomes Prime Minister because it's so fascinating. He was the brightest student of his era. The first Alpha Plus economic theory student at Oxford. But while he was doing that, he won 2 huge glittering prizes. The Gladstone Prize, for which he had to write an essay almost as big as that, long as that book, and the Webb Medley Prize that got him a scholarship and a postgrad. Then became a Don at the age of 21. So success as a student, success as an academic. Then when the war broke out, became a civil servant, was amazingly successful at accessing timber for the Ministry of Works, writing a paper on coal nationalisation, how you could do it properly, that eventually ended up as a kind of blueprint for the Labour government. This is all before he's gone anywhere near Parliament.
I met him quite a few times, and the last time I remember was at a funeral, and and the thing about lack of pretentiousness, he was just sitting like sort of 6-7 rows back, and I ended up sitting next to him at this. It was a funeral of an MP from Liverpool. And by then he had dementia or whatever. But I remember having conversations with him prior to that, where he was incredibly clever, unbelievably smart, informed, but he didn't mind emanating a sense of the wiles. There was a mythology about him that was very attractive to somebody like me who was interested in politics and political engagement. So I think you're right to have done this. I love Jim Callaghan to bits, but I think you're right to have said, if you want to find a really interesting prime minister that needs
I'm free to do Jim if they're interested, but given the choice of the two,
you've got to write the screenplay now as well.
Well, yeah, absolutely.
This movie,
because he was so much part of the 60s as well. That's the other thing. If you think of the 60s, Tony said you might have been, when Wilson died, you were in opposition. Yeah, so you'd have been working for Tony. I read Tony's speech as leader of the opposition. Major made a very good speech as Prime Minister. Tony said he dominated the political scene in the 60s in the same way that the Beatles dominated the music scene. And that is absolutely true.
That as well.
Even at his, even at his nadir after devaluation, he was still getting approval ratings that were extraordinary, particularly compared to recent examples. And the other thing is, he was successful as leader of the opposition. He made the weather. The White Heat of Technology speech, in which he called for 200,000 extra university places, the creation of the Open University, as well as that great thing about the White Heat of Technology. He was leader of the opposition. He wasn't a minister. He wasn't prime minister. And yet it's still thought of as one of the most influential speeches. So he succeeded as leader of the opposition, which is a very difficult, I know Tony did as well, but it's a very difficult job to succeed in and to make the political weather.
Yeah.
How do you think, as you've researched him, politics has changed from the parliament that Wilson entered and the parliament that you left? What happened over that period?
Well, I think there were two big differences. Wilson's parliament mainly consisted of people who'd been through the war, in the military, in some capacity or other. Wilson would have gone and fought. In fact, it was Hugh Gateskill, funnily enough, who became his kind of nemesis, who was a senior civil servant in wartime. He said we shouldn't lose all this talent the same way as we did in the First World War. They had a very recent example and kind of engineered that he would never be called up. But anyway, most of the MPs there had done things and been through things. And there was an ideological, obviously, reaction of anti-fascism because Stalin was our ally during the war. There was not so much of a kind of feeling that communism was a bad thing. And there were people like Wilson who was saying, whatever you think of communism, Russia's a big power and we need to have more trade with them and all of that. I think there were fewer women. I mean, Barbara Castle was one of only 26 women who came in 24 of them were on Labour's benches, by the way, in the 1945 election. It was very much on the Tory side, and this is something else that Wilson would eventually change, very Edwardian. I mean, this idea that, Sir Alec Douglas-Home, who was his predecessor, was in any way connected to people's lives. You mostly saw him in +4s out on the grouse moor. And the analogy that Wilson used, which answers your question as well, I mean, yeah, Parliament has changed the way society has changed. Wilson used the analogy of cricket, that in 1962, finally endorsed by the MCC in 1963, the amateur versus professional, mainly put down as players, gentlemen versus players. There was a match every year, gentlemen versus players, was finally discarded in cricket. And what that meant in cricket's a really good example of the way the class system dominated this country. If you were a player, i.e. professional and good at it, your initials came before your name, W.G. Grace. If you were an amateur, just doing it every so often, mainly because you learnt it at public school, your initials came afterwards, Grace W.G. A famous story about Fred Titmuss, who was walking out onto the onto the oval.
Let's just test Rory's knowledge here. Fred Titmuss, Rory?
Fred Titmuss was a great cricketer. And the announcer said there'd been a mistake in the order of batting. And Titmuss, FW, should be FW Titmuss because he was a player, not a gentleman. So Wilson picked up on that. And here's a talent, Tony had as well, that you can pick an issue to say a very complex issue now you can understand. Well, now they've done away with the distinction between amateurs and professionals, gentlemen and players in cricket. Isn't it about time we did it in politics? Isn't it about time the 14th Earl of Hume, who was Sir Alec Douglas Hume, actually made way for someone of this century? And of course, the plain old Mr. Wilson. Alec Douglas Hume made a really good reaction to him in Parliament. He said, yes, I'm the 14th Earl, but in many ways, gentleman opposite is the 14th Mr. Wilson, which was true, But, you know, that distinction was happening in our society. Wilson changed the leadership of the Tory party forever. They never elected another old Etonian. They elected Heath, and then they elected whoever they elected, blah, blah, blah.
Thatcher,
it wasn't until
it
Cameron came along that they went back to old Etonians. That was really in reaction to Wilson.
What would you say he was also, like, you and I here sort of saying nice things about him, but he was incredibly controversial as well. What would you say were the less attractive sides to his record and his politics?
Someone said, and I forget who said it, that he had a real predilection to surround himself with very rich, powerful men. And he did. There's no doubt about that. That kind of came out eventually in the famous Lavender List. You know, if you look at the scandals attached to Wilson, there's Marcia, who we might come back to, there's devaluation, and there's the Lavender List.
And the Lavender List is appointing a couple of pretty dodgy people. One of them gets a peerage, one of them gets a knighthood. Yeah.
10 really, of which, there was the he was stepping down as Prime Minister, stepped down incidentally at an age younger than Keir Starmer was walking into 10 Downing Street. It was age 60. There was the beginnings. No one is quite sure when that wonderful brain, he had a photographic memory, when that wonderful brain started to deteriorate. But it kind of was. The other thing, which we'll come on to, is the kind of paranoia about a security service. They're the things that you would say would be negatives.
But tell us a bit about some of the dodgy people he gave.
So he gave a peerage to Lord Kagan, Joseph Kagan, who made the Gannex raincoat that no one knows what the Gannex raincoat now was, but Wilson wore it. If you look at a picture of Wilson, you see him in a Gannex raincoat. It's a different type of material, made close to his constituency. He was great friends with Kagan. And when on his resignation, I mean, the stupid thing, as I say in the book, is that there's a resignation, list for the Lords, but nevertheless, at least one Prime Minister's put their hairdresser on it. He put his constituency agent on it. He put a number of other people who wouldn't be controversial, but he put Kagan on it.
And Kagan was a little bit dubious.
A bit dubious. He was being examined then, but had not been arrested. It wasn't until 1980, this is 1976, it wasn't until 1980 that he served time for dodging the Inland Revenue. There was another character on there who 2 years later, or just about 2 years later, committed suicide while he was under investigation for financial irregularities.
And I'm kind of just sort of trying to get my head around this, but in the 70s, Labour, Conservative, Lib Dems, there's some pretty strange stuff. Conservative chancellors getting up to strange financial business after they leave. Liberal leaders famously murdering people. I mean, what's going on?
I don't think they murdered anyone. No, Rory, let's hang on. Let's,
well, he's
on
dead,
behalf
so
of
you
Ed
can't lie
Davey,
with
I
the
have to
dead,
put in an opposition. A point here, a point of order. Well, this is the paranoia. So I say with Wilson and the stuff that you see about him going into the gentlemen's toilets and turning on all the water in the House of Commons before he'd have a chat with someone, I say it was late-stage paranoia meets early-stage dementia. His late-stage paranoia, I say in the book, he was a man who was paranoid but had a lot to be paranoid about. MI5 opened a file on him in 1945, called him Norman John Worthington, because he went to Russia a couple of times. This is the kind of world we were living in. By the time that was all bad, there was other incidents. By the time it came to the 70s, which is the most recent period for you, Rory, here, the world had gone absolutely wacky. He came back into power in 74. There were all these Colonel Blimps, retired military men, one of whom, Walter Wallace, who was, very senior, wrote a letter to the Daily Telegraph saying maybe people have had enough of democracy by the ballot box. Maybe they'd like to see a bit of order restored through, he didn't use the term barrel of a gun, but that's what he meant. At the same time, you had the CIA, described by a Senate committee as rogue elephants. Still unclear who authorized the attempt to assassinate Castro. And the CIA were active in London and in England. And because Wilson had refused to send troops, British troops, to Vietnam, he was a kind of candidate to be discredited. And you had BOSS, the South African Secret Service, who were very active in London, responsible, so it's said, for the guy who attempted assassination on Jeremy Thorpe's lover, story we all know about now, for a very English scandal.
He's the murdering Liberal leader that Rory referred to.
He's the one, yes. And Thorpe told Wilson they had a good relationship. In fact, if Heath had done a deal after the 74 deal of 74, when he won the popular vote but didn't have enough seats, he offered Jeremy Thorpe a seat as Home Secretary in a combined government. That would have been interesting. Thorpe had told Wilson all about the plots and all that. And so Wilson knew there were all these issues going around, and there's lots of others. Because MI5, the security service, I was responsible for as Home Secretary and love them dearly and think they do a great job. But they were masters to themselves for years and years. It wasn't until the late 80s under Thatcher that there was any parliamentary oversight, Security and Intelligence Committee.
Just put Wilson in your league table of Labour leaders through your lifetime. Who you put in top?
That's really difficult. I have thought about this. That's really difficult because I was part of the Blair. I mean, the reason I have a political career at all is because of Tony Blair ringing me up and asking me if I was interested in being an MP. To which I said, "Don't be stupid. What would I want to do that for, Tony? I'm the General Secretary of the sixth biggest affiliated union." Anyway, he was persistent. So I can't judge Tony. And I was part of that government. I thought it was a great government. This is the 20th anniversary of my elevation to cabinet. You'd gone by then. But, all of the stuff we were doing, I thought was tremendous. So can I judge Wilson against that? Can I judge Wilson against Attlee? Attlee was probably, people say Bevan was Wilson's mentor. I don't think Bevan was. You have to say Bevan so that people don't get confused with Bevan. Because Bevan and Bevan with Ernie. But I think it was more Attlee. It was Attlee who saw the talent of Wilson and projected him and promoted him and all the rest of it. And, Wilson's youngest son, Giles, his godparents are Mr. and Mrs. Attlee. Well, Mr. and Mrs. Attlee. So I find it impossible to judge. I think Wilson should be up there in the pantheon. I mean, I think he's a great prime minister. He was the youngest cabinet minister since 1806. Sir Henry Petty was the last one who got in that young. His experience, the things he dealt with, my final point on this, the things that meant a lot to people's lives, sorting out the divorce laws that meant my mother, even after she was abandoned, couldn't divorce. It was the men ruled on whether a wife could be divorced or not. It was Wilson that introduced irretrievable breakdown. It was Wilson that legislated to ensure that homosexuality wasn't illegal. It was Wilson. I know Jenkins played his role, but Wilson was the prime minister. Got rid of the backstreet abortionists, introduced a Redundancy Act, introduced the Health and Safety Act, which stopped the carnage in British factories.
I'm hearing Tony getting relegated to number 2.
He's not, no, because he'll never be relegated in my view. But so all I'm saying is it's difficult for me. But for someone who's neutral, who wasn't part of the Blair government, I think Wilson would be up there.
So Alan has introduced himself, his childhood, his fascination with Harold Wilson, he's just written a great book on, talked about his time in the trade union movement a bit and ending up as running the trade union movement, and then a moment at which Tony Blair rings you up and suggests you become a member of parliament. So tell us a little bit about, firstly, that transition. You very kindly read my book. I found entering the House of Commons very weird. What was your first experience? Do you remember entering the House of Commons?
I remember it very well. In those days, you could drive in through the gate. Yeah, there was a couple of coppers there. Nobody even searched the car, I think. I drove there from where we lived in Crystal Palace. So it wasn't very long, sort of 20-minute drive. I went down to that underground garage. And next to the space I parked in, next to it was an open-top, 2-seated sports car. and out of it unfolded Alan Clark. I mean, I say unfolded.
It's Alastair's great friend.
Don't get him going, Alan. Don't get him going. It's one of his 11 cars.
Alan Clark coincidentally tried to give him a Bentley. Has he told you the story?
No, really. Were you pals with
I was quite pals with Alan Clark.
I never met him, but I followed him into the Commons, and he, as I say, leapt out of that car, had nothing. He'd come back into Parliament in the 97 election. Remember, he'd lost his seat. 92, came back to member for Kensington and Chelsea, where I was born. He could have been my MP. And he put his hands in his pockets, nonchalantly ran his hands through his hair. I had briefcases, documents, boxes, I didn't know where I was going. This was a completely new world for me. I'd been to the Commons, but not through that member's entrance and the little cloakroom with the bit of ribbon to hang his sword and all that. Yeah. And I thought, I don't know where I'm going. I recognise Alan Clark. I'll just follow him. And I followed him up the escalator through, and he's almost whistling. It wasn't quiet, but almost whistling. And I'm trudging along to try and keep up with him with all this stuff. And eventually because it was such a huge a majority, rather like now, I guess, you had all these people wandering around, didn't know where to go or what to do, and you had little lockers to put your stuff. And then it took you a while before you got some staff. It was very traumatic, I think, is the main thing. But, we were on the government benches. That always attracted me. That's why in the end, Tony, I think, persuaded me, not just because I was absolutely behind him. I'd stood up, the only trade union leader, to support changing Clause 4 of the Constitution.
So you would have been seen as more on the right wing of the trade union movement in those days.
Yeah, and I suppose that's true. Although in Labour terms, talking about being on the right, we're all on the left. The people on the far left are just, away with the birds or on a different planet. But all of us are on the left. We are democratic socialists or social democrats, whatever you want to call us. And so I quickly settled in, mainly because, and this is where I'm absolutely with you, Rory, because I read your fabulous book. I reviewed it as well and said it was fabulous at the time. So I'm not just saying it here. I loved my constituency. My constituency didn't choose me. I was imposed. When I took the parachute off and looked around in Hull, Western Hessel, I found a wonderful place, not just because I've always been interested in poetry, where here's the place where Andrew Marvell was the MP. Forget Larkin, Stevie Smith, Not Waving But Drowning, born in West Hull.
Forget Larkin. I don't think you'd have said that during the campaign, would you?
I wouldn't have said any of that, no. And when I got there, Larkin wasn't a great hero, by the way. There wasn't even a statue of him. But it was the biggest fishing port, distant water fishing port in the world. It had been. And that had all disappeared overnight. You could walk across St Andrew's Quay from one trawler to the others. There were 250 of them, and now there was just one.
Did you get any?
And through that slump, by the way, the trawlermen were promised all kinds of things. Promised retraining, promised money, promised redeployment. They got nothing. They were classified as casual workers.
Did you get any resistance to, you used the word parachute. So Stuart Randall was the MP, wasn't he?
Yeah.
And he stood down and miraculously ended up in the House of Lords, and you came in.
Thank you, Stuart.
Did you get any resistance because of that? And you're not a northerner.
You're from London.
Watford, you thought was the north.
Yeah, I did have an auntie, my mother's sister.
Which you made a great deal of, I'm sure.
Who married a soldier, a Hull soldier, who was actually my mum's boyfriend. My auntie nicked him off of her. They went to Hull and had 9 kids, so I figured I had a built-in majority, but they didn't all live in my constituency. No, I'd been there once. Not really. Mainly because Stuart had an awful lot of problems through the age of militant and all that. He kind of was a bit of a matinee idol, pretending he was militant and then wasn't. I might be being unfair to him, but he promised he'd move to the constituency and never did. There was a vote of no confidence in him. He only won it by 1 vote. So in a sense, I came in. And he had a different headquarters. There were 2 headquarters in here. I came in halfway through the general election. And there were 2 headquarters, and one Stuart had the key to, and the other one he didn't.
And this is too traumatic for any of you to be funny and concise about it, but can you just tell us very briefly, what was militant for our younger listeners?
If you think of momentum more recently around Corbyn, Militant was, in a way, much more pernicious.
Oh, yeah.
Much more pernicious and much nastier. And really, it was one of the things that have happened ever since the Labour Party was created in 1900. These kind of off to the, on a different planet, far left groups decide the only way they can manage to get any power is to wear Labour's clothes to get elected. Couldn't get elected on their own platform. So entryism was a big thing. Has always been a big thing.
And they had very radical left-wing views.
Very radical. In the time of Wilson was crypto-communists, they used to call them, and they were all over the place. But this was Trotskyists, basically. I mean, they had no time for Stalin.
What did Trotskyists believe in? I mean, they call themselves Trotskyists. I don't even understand. What were they thinking about?
They believed Stalin was a sellout, basically. They believed that any attempt to... get a Trotskyist and I'll explain it to you. But basically, they felt that the revolution was betrayed. The revolution was betrayed because internationalism and, ensuring that there was a proletariat, dictatorship proletariat right across the world, that was the job. And you don't compromise on that.
And so I suppose that Tony Blair's rise to power and the move, Neil Kinnock and John Smith and Tony Blair, was painful. I mean, more painful than conservative politics, because presumably the people on the left felt very morally superior. They felt right was on their side. They were on the side of radical equality, revolutionary change, and you lot were a bunch of sellouts. So it must have been much more painful than conservative politics, these fights.
Well, I think conservative politics might go that way. I doubt it will ever be as bad as in the early 80s.
No, it was brutal.
Yeah, things can only get better. The great book by John O'Farrell. He explains and this is very much my experience of this, as I was in Slough at the time, Slough Labour Party. He describes a constituency meeting. They only had a bit of money, one leaflet to a big council estate. Should we make it about the cuts to local council and, bin collectors not coming round? Or should we make it about Nicaragua? Militant were in the majority and they had to walk around this council estate delivering leaflets on Nicaragua. That's a great example of what things were like.
So that's why when Jeremy Corbyn came in, some people on the right Labour Party would slightly tease him about talking about Venezuela and Palestine because they had sort of memories of a day when it felt as though people weren't talking about things that were relevant to voters. Absolutely. And, we'd seen it. Jeremy had been there for a long time, what he's doing now, which is not a Labour MP. But the difference was he was sitting on Labour's benches. He's never bought into our constitution, particularly the new one.
Yeah. Tony sort of chased you down a bit like he chased me down a few years ago and never sort of didn't give up. Just talk us through how he kind of wore you down to become candidate. You were sort of, I can't remember how your name first came up, but you were sort of on this list of people that we thought were good MPs. Well,
you were a big deal, right? I mean, you were running a big union.
I know about a big deal. It was a big union and we'd had a big victory. We stopped Heseltine and Major privatising the post office. Everyone had lost those disputes, whether it was rail, whether it was
how did you win?
Steel, whether it's...
Tell us a bit about the tactics.
There's a great documentary about it, Michael Cockerell documentary about it. We employed the Tories' PR agents and we got behind Tory lines and we got the Tories really, really rabid about the effect of this. Your local post office will close, you end your Saturday delivery and all of that. Forget 2 deliveries a day, all the things that have happened post-privatisation, by the way. But this was the early 90s. And because we won it, it was seen as a big thing. Tony was very pleased. And this documentary by Michael Cockerell that Tony might well have watched.
I doubt it. But
it was a word in the right ear. It was about lobbying, and he made our campaign the centrepiece of a 1-hour programme. It was at least 25 minutes.
No, but also you were quite high profile just around the place and across the media, and you were very, very, you were clearly of our politics, and you were also clearly a very good communicator.
Because of that, really, I had a profile, only because of that. But no, I'm driving up Gypsy Hill. This thing that's like a brick next to me, which is apparently called a mobile phone, goes. I did pull over because I was late for my mother-in-law's birthday party, picked it up. I'd had a thing with Tony about a candidate election in Newport. Remember when Alan Howarth crossed the floor? And I wanted to talk to him because we had a good guy, Reg Kelly, who was in Newport, and we wanted to be assured that it was going to be a vote of the members. Angie comes on the line. Angie puts me through to Tony. Tony says, yes, no question of it. It's going to be an open ballot.
And we'll win it.
But he said, Alan, just as I'm trying to get away because I've got my mother-in-law, I hear you want to be an MP. I said, I don't know, I told you that, Tony. I've not got the slightest wish to be an MP. And I didn't have the slightest wish to be an MP. I mean, why would I want to go to the backbenches? Anyway, he said, well, I'd quite like you to be an MP. You know the way he had it. I'd quite like you to be an MP. I thought, bloody hell, Come and talk to me, he said. I was on the NEC, the Labour Party. So I went and spoke to him. I said, well, where would the seat be? He said, well, where do you want it to be? Because what we know now is all those MPs who were going to step down
to
spend more time with their peerages. He knew
who they were.
That was coming up. But, I mean, this is where I feel guilty because, I mean, you did it through a very unique route, through the kind of Cameron's flirtation with primaries. I see so many of my colleagues who slogged away for years, moved the family to places where they thought the MP was going to, breathe their last. And here was I being asked by the leader of the party, oh, which seat would you. Anyway.
And can I interrupt? Did you think that there was a chance that you might become a minister? I mean, when you were thinking, am I going to really give up a job I really care about to be a backbench MP for the rest of my life?
I wanted to be a minister. I didn't want to be, but it looked pretty certain. This is February 1997.
And the leader of the Labour Party's made it clear that he wants you. So if you are reasonably
should be all right. He never made any. There was no deal. He never said, "Oh, you're about it. You have to. You got to make sure you."
Tony never made deals.
No,
as we know.
Is that right? Well, he didn't make one with me.
We got a smirk. From him. We don't know what that smirk meant.
I didn't even try to argue that I want to be a minister, but I thought, am I going to get to 60 and look back and think, I missed that opportunity. Here's the leader asking me. And so having thought it over, I didn't care where it was.
And can I bring you in? To what extent were you involved in this sort of thing? Deciding someone like that should be an MP, deciding that someone might become a minister? I mean, go on, tell us a little bit about you. Would you have chats with Tony Blair about this stuff?
I can remember talking about the sorts of people that would be good. Tony definitely wanted some good new people coming at the end. He actually asked me at one point to get a seat.
Yeah.
And I said,
do you wish you had?
No, but
yes, he does. He really
I think he does.
Do you?
I do. Yeah, I do.
Anyway, I said, do you want me to be an MP or do you want me to run the campaign? Oh, yeah, he said, you better do the campaign. But no, Alan was definitely one of the, I'd say, in the top few that Tony was quite keen on. So, yeah, probably.
And were you involved in him becoming a minister?
Alan?
Yeah.
I don't know. There'd be discussions.
I've got this suspicion that you were behind. I mean, not becoming a minister. I was a minister. I was PPS same year I got elected to a wonderful woman called Dawn Primarola as Paymaster General. Then in 1999, Junior Minister DTI PUS, then Minister of State. Then I get a phone call after the 2001 election, and I'm going over the Humber Bridge in the back of a government Jag because I'd done something at Bishop Burton College, my role as DTI Minister. And the phone rings, there's a reshuffle going on, and Tony said, Alan, on the back seat of the car, I said, Alan, I'm always on the phone to Tony, aren't I? According to this story I'm telling. I'm on the phone to him again, but it's a government car. He said, Alan, I'd like you to go to education. I'd like you to be the Minister for Higher Education. And I said, absolutely no word of a lie. I said, Tony, Minister for Higher Education, you realise I left school at 15. I never went to university. He said, precisely. Precisely. The reason I thought your hand might be in this is because we'd unveiled the need for tuition fees at the back of the Deering Commission on higher education. Deering from Hull, my old mate from the post office as well. And he'd said, look, those who benefit from higher education should make a contribution. And that included not students, graduates. Once they've graduated, once they're earning, blah, blah, blah. Perfect formula. I supported it instinctively. It was very controversial. The minister at the time was under the accusation that came to all of them, you're pulling up the ladder after you. You got a free university education with generous grants. Tony had clocked, and this is where I saw the hand of Alastair Campbell, that actually if you put someone in there that didn't go to university, you're going to stand a fight.
Well, I'm really touched that you assume that if something clever and smart and Wilsonian has happened, that should be down to me. So I'm happy to take credit. I'm happy to take credit.
And moving on, I mean, you went on from that to be the Secretary of State for Health, which is, as famously people say, kind of the biggest train set in government. This enormous, over £100 billion machine, million employees, etc. I mean, that must have been an incredible responsibility, and it must have been sort of completely overwhelming to try to get your head around something so big, so complicated, hundreds of millions of GP appointments a year. I mean, how do you get your head around something like that?
Well, this is now Gordon Brown.
Yeah.
So Alastair's departed the scene. Tony's departed the scene. On the day he went, on the evening he went, Gordon said, well, you can stay at education if you want. But incidentally, I'm going to make it this schools and families thing. And I'm going to take higher education and further education, put it in another department. But you can do that if you want. My priority is health. And I'd quite like you to go to health. Well, of course you go to health. I was really fortunate because the heavy lifting, we're now talking about 2007, the 10-year plan, and we're living this life again now, including Aradazi. I'll mention him in a second. 10-year plan was well underway. We'd been recruiting nurses and doctors. The famous announcement Tony made on the Sunday TV that he's going to increase the budget of the health. We were now going towards 110 billion. It's 160 now, but we're going towards 110 billion, which was incredible.
Yeah.
Investment per head of population. So, all that bit. Patricia Hewitt, my predecessor, had been through hell. You might remember nurses screaming and shouting at her at conferences. That's because she was sorting out the budgets of the local primary care groups. Which is a long story.
Alan Milburn had done these big reports.
Alan Milburn had done his bit. Everyone had done their bit.
I should warn you, Alan, that Alan Milburn is Rory's hero.
Yeah. Well, he's a hero of mine as well. He's a good friend. And he's back doing the same thing again, I see, or is certainly in the picture. Gordon knew what he wanted to do on health. He knew exactly what he wanted to do, one of which was to say, look, there's this guy, Aradazi, who's a surgeon. And Gordon had been to a presentation that Ara made about a number of visits people have to make, the bus journeys to here, to there. And it was about, shifting healthcare to the communities, all of that. He said, I'd like to bring Aradazi in. Remember, they were called GOATs, Government of All the Talents.
That's right, yeah.
I'd like to bring Ara in as a minister and for him to work with you as a Minister of State. Now, the first thing that springs to mind when you think of a major leading surgeon isn't humility, is it? I mean, let's face it.
No.
Would this guy be satisfied to be a Minister of State? Because it was Ara, who is a wonderful person, by the way. I mean, you wouldn't know. He used to, at St. Mary's, where he's a surgeon, used to go in sometimes dressed as a porter. Because when he stepped in the lift as a surgeon, everyone drew back and bowed to him and paid homage. He went as a porter to see what the kind of reaction was to him as a porter, dressed up. I mean, he's that kind of guy. There's no airs and graces about Ara. And we forged a very good relationship. But that was Gordon's idea. I had 2 great years. First of all, because it was 2 years, and I was usually moved on, after a year. But it was
utility player.
Yeah, it was 2 years. We dealt with some really big issues and some. I loved everything about it. There was the NHS used to withdraw treatment from someone who couldn't get a drug. NICE, which was probably Alan Milburn's greatest contribution, by the way. NICE hadn't approved the drug.
Just to explain to listeners, NICE
National
Institute of Clinical Excellence.
And they decide
whether the drugs, And now all over the world, people follow the NICE judgments. Anyway, if someone who was terminally ill was paid for that drug, if they could, for whatever reason, all NHS treatment was withdrawn from them. And it was barbaric. And everyone told me, including Andrew Lasley, who's my opposite number, by the way, he wasn't pressing for this. People told me if you remove that, the whole of the NHS will collapse. And I got a very good surgeon called Mike Richards. We used to have some really good people around, not just Ara, surgeons, health professionals. I said, Mike, have a look at this, because this seems to me to be absolutely awful. If we change this rule that's been there since 1947, will it mean, the sky will fall in? And he came back and said, just do it. Just do it. So we just did it. And it's never been mentioned since. It's fine. Not many people can do that.
Yeah.
But imagine saying, well, you might be a modest income and you've sold your house for this. Yeah. Well, we're not going to treat you anymore. Go somewhere else.
You mentioned that we're sort of back here again. So we talked about Aradazi's report on the podcast recently, and I pointed out that he wrote a very similar report in 2008. It feels like things are worse than they were. It feels like the economic situation is worse than it was. So how can the government turn this around?
On health?
Yeah.
Let me just tell you a little anecdote. Ara's first report came out and said GP surgeries ought to be open in the evening when people are free to go there. They go, why are they closed on Saturday mornings? Big BMA campaign against it. Who joined them? The Conservative Party. Andrew Lansley joined the BMA in saying no to extended opening hours. Seems incredible, doesn't it? But that's what happened. How are they going to turn it around now? Well, I think to a certain extent, this is history repeating itself because the waiting times are now back. I'm not sure if they're as bad. When we came in 97, people waited years for a simple cataract operation. They waited, at least 18 months. In fact, John Major had said under the Citizens' Charter, no one will wait more than 18 months. Yeah. Months. We were reducing it down eventually to an average of 9 weeks, maximum of 18 weeks. Can you do that again? Yes, but you need help and you have to bring in, all hands on
but you need money
to
as
the
well.
pump.
Do you?
You do, yeah. Well, they're paying. You see that the way we did it, and the beauty of it was a single tariff. You didn't pay extra because you were using the private sector. You didn't pay extra because it was one tariff, and that tariff applied for a hip operation, whether it's in the private sector or the public sector.
But it will.
So that's not beyond. The budget now is 160 billion.
But I guess where Alastair's getting to, and certainly where I'm getting to, is that one of the things that helped you along with the reforms is Gordon Brown very significantly and Tony Blair significantly increased expenditure. And health inflation has been much bigger than government spending for the last 14 years. And Aradazi's report has just said that the government needs to put in tens of billions. It's 37 billion just
on capital spending.
Yeah, just on capital. So I guess, I don't want to put you on the spot too much or put you into kind of tribal complication here, but surely one of the issues is that it's going to be quite difficult to sort out without quite a lot of cash. And the question is where the hell's that money coming from?
It's going to be difficult, but that's capital is not revenue. So Ara's making the point on that that backlog will just get worse if it's not sorted out. Others have said that. So leave aside the revenue issue. How can you raise money there? Well, we know the private sector have been sitting on wads of cash. We know there's been no public-private partnership since Hammond stood up in Parliament in 2018. You were there, Rory, and said not just that PFI is going to go, I'll mention PFI in a second, but no form of public-private partnership. There's forms of public-private partnership out there, like the lift model that built the health centres all around the country that are not PFIs. They're not 90%, 10%, i.e. 90 private sector, 10%. They're 60-40. The developer actually is in charge of it, not the contractor. There are forms of public-private partnership that companies are willing to get involved in if we come up with the right model. There's not been any kind of model for 9 years. That has to be one solution on capital. While you wait for the revenue situation, maybe, although there is 160 billion pound going into the NHS now. So you need that reform before any more money comes in. But you can tackle what is really Ara's pointed it out as the priority now, because why is productivity bad? Because they don't have good equipment.
So you did trade, you did pensions, working pensions, you did education, you did health, and you're also Home Secretary. I always thought you were in favour of identity cards.
I was, of course. I introduced them.
Right, but
still got mine if you want to see it. But it's run out.
But where are you now on the sort of the politics of immigration? Did we handle it well? Did we underestimate the impact? What should a new Labour government now be doing to tackle immigration as a political issue?
Well, we didn't handle it in the way we're accused of handling it, i.e. an open door. That all comes from 2004 when the Eastern Bloc came in. And we said, us, Sweden and Ireland, who were the three most successful economies in Europe, we had 600,000 vacancies. I was at Work and Pensions at the time. We need, there's no qualifying period. People can come here straight away. And then you had the Polish plumber and all of that. And probably in hindsight, that was a mistake, only because of the optics of it. I mean, as well as I know, people say Tony wasn't concerned in, open door immigration. God, he was fanatical about ensuring that we had that. That's why David Blunkett went and did that deal in France.
With Sarkozy, With
Sarkozy. So what happened, my view on this is that we, in the end, when that referendum came, the majority of British people, I think, if you say to them, immigration's been good for this country, they will agree, but it needs to be controlled, they will agree. In the end, when it came to the referendum in 2016, Farage and others were able to say with some justification, but it's not controlled from 26 countries in Europe. It's not controlled. Not just that, they were meant to tell us we were never part of Schengen. We were meant to know if serious criminals were trying to come into this country from countries in the European Union. We never got the information. So we didn't know. And all of that, just happening in Germany now, you know, they're kind of looking to go back on Schengen. Well, if they'd been in that ball game in 2015, 2016, the European Union, because people want in this country, and I think in most other countries, they want immigrants to feel safe here. They are liberal about immigration as long as it's controlled. And when it looks like it's not controlled, you're going to get people saying, well,
one thing you were
close the border.
Very strongly involved in was the Remain campaign. What lessons have you drawn from that? What went wrong there? What could have gone better?
Well, my job was to get the Labour vote out. And I suppose, you know, I would say this, wouldn't I? The statistics show that 67% of Labour supporters voted to Remain, right? So in that sense, it's job done. I'm convinced it would have been 75% if we had a different leader. I mean, Jeremy was...
Corbyn was not leaning
Corbyn
into it.
was for Leave and not for Remain.
And also that Cameron and Osborne both thought if only we could get Jeremy Corbyn out more, somehow it was going to shift the vote. When actually every time he went out, I think he pushed it backwards.
Bad, yeah, absolutely.
What was that like for you working in that environment?
It was okay because I was on the Labour side, and the Labour side had people like Blunkett coming to talk, and we had Tony, you know, and in a sense we were amongst friends. It was the big campaign that was taxpayer funded that should have been making the argument to the general public, not us. We were making the argument to Labour supporters. But if we could have got more Labour supporters out, I think we might well have tipped the balance because it was so close. I told Kevin Maguire, the famous Daily Mirror journalist, the night before, I think it's going to be a Leave vote. I felt it. In fact, in the end, I thought 52-48 was closer than I thought it was going to be because they had everything in their favour. You go on the doorstep in Hull, Western Hessel, wherever you were, and try and explain this great idea of Monet and Schumann about bringing countries together after the war. Or you go on the doorstep and you say, take back control. Who's going to win that? It's quite obvious.
We're coming sort of towards the end. And I think almost for my last question, can you reflect a little bit on what you learnt about what makes a good politician and what makes a bad politician? And I'd love to see a couple of things. One of them, your strength and weaknesses as a politician, and then maybe what you've seen in other people and strength and weaknesses as politicians.
It's like being on the psychiatrist's couch with you two. I think decisiveness is crucial. Decisiveness is crucial. I like to think I was decisive. I know of junior ministers and even ministers whose problem was that they couldn't make a decision. They waited ages and ages and ages before they make a decision. Now, I know sometimes that can be the wrong decision, but what the civil service want, you know this, is a decisive minister. And they'll put all the arguments, but once you're in a car, it's dual control, you've got a civil service next to you. If you're not going to put the car in gear and drive it away,
it's not going to go.
They will. I think that's crucial. I think, special advisors is a crucial issue here. I had brilliant special advisors. They came with me to every department and they didn't have any expertise, obviously. They didn't need expertise in that department. They had expertise at work and pensions when I originally recruited them. But they were good at linking the civil service with the ministerial team. They were, you hear so many stories about special advisors who kind of walk around as Jack the Lads because they've got a minister's ear and treat civil servants with disdain. Mine never did do that, which I think was part of our success. Any success, in the sense of staying and not getting sacked.
And your weaknesses as a minister, what do you think, looking back, you were less good at in the game? Or as a politician, what were you less good at in the game?
Oh, I should have been more tuned in to politics as a whole. It was always, to me, a kind of it was fun. I was enjoying it, but I was also enjoying reading books. I was enjoying listening to music. I think really it's so all-consuming that the times when I thought, when that's gone wrong, was because I didn't pay enough attention to it, and I should have been all over it. And I admire the ministers who really are thinking about it day and night, but I'm afraid that's just not me.
That's what I said right at the start. I think that's what stopped you maybe thinking that you could have been.
Oh, I couldn't have been.
Top drawer material.
I couldn't have been. I'm not top drawer material. And that's the simple fact of that is unless you think you're top drawer material, you're not top drawer material.
But I think both Rory and I would agree that you are more prime ministerial material than Liz Truss or Boris Johnson.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, that's not a very high bar.
No, it's a very low bar. But look, you were, including from me, you were put under all sorts of pressures at various points to say, look,
yeah, but that's because, number one, they thought I should stab Gordon in the back in the midst of not you. There were people coming to me. The PLP, they're going to put this letter in, Alan. This is Gordon in the middle of dealing with the financial services crash, which he did very well, by the way.
That's
in the middle of
James Parnell and people were standing up and going,
whoever. I don't like to name friends, but there were plenty of people looking and saying to me, well, someone's got to step in there, and it should be. There's no way I was going to have anything to do with that.
But
no way. And the same happened with Ed Miliband, by the way.
For sure.
Yeah.
But then when Gordon stood down, you didn't even think about standing.
I nominated David Miliband. Yeah. I went on the Today programme specifically to say, look, I'm not standing, but here's this guy.
But there was never a part of you that thought maybe you could and should.
Only when it looked like we might go into coalition with the Lib Dems. There was that weekend, you were in 10 Downing Street most of the time. And it looked like Lib Dems came to talk to us. I've always been a supporter of proportional representation. I was dealing with Chris Hoon and all that. And I thought the cabinet was thinking, well, we'll have to appoint someone if this works. And it was going to be
Gordon goes.
It was going to be for 3 years. Gordon knew he had to go.
Yeah.
It would be for 3 years. And I would have put my hat in the ring. So on Sunday night, I was thinking, yeah, okay,
maybe
dereliction of duty if you don't really do that. By Monday, of course, the coalition had formed very sensibly. But I think we could have just about put the numbers together.
Good. Well, lovely to talk to you, there, Alan. Good luck with the book.
Thank you very much.
And the other thing about you, I don't know about you, Rory, we all get invited to a lot of book festivals because we write lots of books. You love book festivals, don't you?
I only write books to go to book festivals. That's what my wife says.
What is it about book festivals that you love so much?
I love them. Oh, God. Well, there's a little bit of the musician bit in me, that you're on the stage. There's a little bit of the politician that you get very interesting questions from very nice people who are not out to slit your throat, as they sometimes were at political meetings. And, people who like books. I've been steeped in books since I was a kid, and meeting other people who like books. What's not to like? They're wonderful.
Good, okay.
If only you were less cynical, Alastair, and more appreciative of your own literary skills.
Without talking up the three of us, which is the temptation and this answers question, books by politicians that you've admired, are there good politician writers that you've liked over time? You
mean I can't talk about you two? Not novels. I've not read. I mean, I did read 75 Virgins, whatever it was, which was Boris Johnson's.
I made it through the first 6 pages.
Well, only because I was so fascinated to know whether someone who can string a sentence together, let's face it, he could adapt to fiction, and he can't. So I've not read Disraeli's. Disraeli's are probably the only ones that I probably would like. So on fiction, no. On non-fiction, I think I'm sitting in front of at least my one favourite writer. You can come into it with the diaries, but Politics on the Edge is a masterclass.
Thank you, Alan, very much.
Well done, Rory. You set himself up for a quote for the paperback. What good?
He's already got one.
Very good. Thanks a lot.
Thanks you very much.